Miss Poe was evidently anxious to prove that such terrible events had occurred within her experience that she was justified in her sudden panic, and Miss Mattie did not like to be outdone, and capped every story with one yet more horrible, till it reminded me, oddly enough, of an old story I had read somewhere of a nightingale and a musician, who strove one against the other, which could produce the most admirable music, till poor Philomel dropped down dead. One of the stories that haunted me for a long time afterwards was of a girl who was left in charge of a great house in Cumberland on some particular fair day, when the other servants all went off to the gaieties. The family were away in London, and a peddler came by and asked to leave his large and heavy pack in the kitchen, saying he would call for it again at night. And the girl, a gamekeeper's daughter, roaming about in search of amusement, chanced to hit upon a gun hanging up in the hall, and took it down to look at the chasing, and it went off through the open kitchen door, hit the pack, and a slow, dark thread of blood came oozing out. How Miss Pole enjoyed this part of the story, dwelling on each word as if she loved it. She rather hurried over the further accounts of the girl's bravery, and I have but a confused idea that somehow she baffled the robbers with Italian irons heated red hot and then restored to blackness by being dipped in grease. We parted for the night with an awe-stricken wonder as to what we should hear in the morning, and on my part, with a vehement desire for the night to be over and gone. I was so afraid lest the robbers should have seen, from some dark lurking place, that Miss Pole had carried off her plate, and thus have a double motive for attacking our house. But until Lady Glenmire came to call next day, we heard of nothing unusual. The kitchen fire irons were in exactly the same position against a back door as when Martha and I had skillfully piled them up, like spillikins, ready to fall in an awful clatter if only a cat had touched the outside panels. I had wondered what we should all do if thus awakened and alarmed, and had proposed to Miss Mattie that we should cover up our faces under the bedcloths so that there should be no danger of the robbers thinking that we could identify them. But Miss Mattie, who was trembling very much, scouted this idea, and said we owed it to society to apprehend them, and that she should certainly do her best to lay hold of them and lock them up in the garret till morning. When Lady Glenmire came, we almost felt jealous of her. Miss Jamieson's house had really been attacked. At least there were men's footsteps to be seen on the flower borders, underneath the kitchen windows, where nay men should be, and Carlo had barked all through the night as if strangers were abroad. Miss Jamieson had been awakened by Lady Glenmire, and they had rung the bells which communicated with Mr. Molyneux's room in the third story, and when his night-capped head had appeared over the banisters in answer to the summons, they had told him of their alarm and the reason for it, whereupon he retreated into his room and locked the door for fear of draughts, as he informed them in the morning, and opened the window and called out valiantly to say, if the supposed robbers would come to him, he would fight them. But as Lady Glenmire observed, that was but poor comfort, since they would have to pass by Miss Jamieson's room and her own before they could reach him, and must be of a very pugnacious disposition indeed if they neglected the opportunities of robbery presented by the unguarded lower stories to go up to the garret, and there force a door in order to get at the champion of the house. Lady Glenmire, after waiting and listening for some time in the drawing-room, had proposed to Miss Jamieson that they should go to bed, but that lady said she should not feel comfortable unless she sat up and watched, and accordingly she packed herself warmly up on the sofa, where she was found by the housemaid when she came into the room at 6 o'clock, fast asleep. But Lady Glenmire went to bed and kept awake all night. When Miss Pole heard of this, she nodded her head in great satisfaction. She had been sure we should hear of something happening in Cranford that night, and we had heard. It was clear enough they had first proposed to attack her house, but when they saw that she and Betty were on their guard and had carried off the plate, they had changed their tactics and gone to Miss Jamieson's, and no one knew what might have happened if Carlo had not barked, like a good dog as he was. Poor Carlo! His barking days were nearly over. Whether the gang who infested the neighborhood were afraid of him, or whether they were revengeful enough for the way in which he had baffled them on the night in question to poison him, or whether, as some among the more uneducated people thought, He died of apoplexy, brought on by too much feeding and too little exercise. At any rate, it is certain that 2 days after this eventful night, Carlo was found dead, with his poor legs stretched out stiff in the attitude of running, as if by some unusual exertion he could escape the sure pursuer, death. We were all sorry for Carlo, the old familiar friend who had snapped at us for so many years, and the mysterious mode of his death made us very uncomfortable. Could Signor Brunoni be at the bottom of this? He had apparently killed a canary with only a word of command. His will seemed of deadly force. Who knew but what he might yet be lingering in the neighborhood, wheeling all sorts of awful things? We whispered these fancies among ourselves in the evenings, but in the mornings our courage came back with the daylight, and in a week's time we had got over the shock of Carlo's death. All but Miss Jameson. She, poor thing, felt it as she had felt no event since her husband's death. Indeed, Miss Pole said that as the Honorable Mr. Jameson drank a good deal and occasioned her much uneasiness, it was possible that Carlo's death might be the greater affliction. But there was always a tinge of cynicism in Miss Pole's remarks. However, one thing was clear and certain. It was necessary for Miss Jameson to have some change of scene, and Mr. Mulliner was very impressive on this point, shaking his head whenever we inquired of his mistress, and speaking of her loss of appetite and bad nights very ominously, and with justice too, for if she had two characteristics in her natural state of health, they were a facility of eating and sleeping. If she could neither eat nor sleep, she must be indeed out of spirits and out of health. Lady Glenmire, who had evidently taken very kindly to Cranford, did not like the idea of Miss Jameson's going to Cheltenham, and more than once insinuated pretty plainly that it was Mr. Mulliner's doing, who had been much alarmed on the occasion of the house being attacked, and since had said more than once that he felt it a very responsible change to have to defend so many women. Be that as it might, Miss Jameson went to Cheltenham, escorted by Mr. Mulliner, and Lady Glenmire remained in possession of the house, her ostensible office being to take care that the maidservants did not pick up followers. She made a very pleasant-looking dragon, and as soon as it was arranged for her to stay in Cranford, she found out that Miss Jameson's visit to Cheltenham was just the best thing in the world. She had let her house in Edinburgh, and was for the time houseless, so the charge of her sister-in-law's comfortable abode was very convenient and acceptable. Miss Pole was very much inclined to install herself as a heroine, because of the decided steps she had taken in flying from the 2 men and 1 woman, whom she entitled the murderous gang. She described their appearance in glowing colors, and I noticed that every time she went over the story, some fresh trait of villainy was added to their appearance. One was tall. He grew to be gigantic in height before we had done with him. He, of course, had black hair, and by it hung in elf locks over his forehead and down his back. The other was short and broad, and a hump sprouted out on his shoulders before we heard the last of him. He had red hair, which deepened into carroty, and she was almost sure he had a cast in the eye, a decided squint. As for the woman, her eyes glared, and she was masculine-looking, a perfect virago, most probable a man dressed in woman's clothes. Afterwards, we heard of a beard on her chin, and a manly voice and a stride. If Miss Pole was delighted to recount the events of that afternoon to all inquirers, others were not so proud of their adventures in the robbery line. Mr. Hoggins, the surgeon, had been attacked at his own door by 2 ruffians, who were concealed in the shadow of the porch, and so effectually silenced him that he was robbed in the interval between ringing his bell and the servants answering it. Miss Pole was sure it would turn out that this robbery had been committed by her men, and went the very day she heard the report to have her teeth examined and to question Mr. Hoggins. She came to us afterwards, so we heard what she had heard, straight and direct from the source, while we were yet in the excitement and flutter of the agitation caused by the first intelligence, for the event had only occurred the night before. "Well," said Miss Pole, sitting down with the decision of a person who has made up her mind as to the nature of life and the world, and such people never tread lightly, or seat themselves without a bump. "Well, Miss Mattie, men will be men. Every mother's son of them wishes to consider Samson and Solomon rolled into one. too strong ever to be beaten or discomfited, too wise ever to be outwitted. If you will notice, they have always foreseen events, though they never tell one for one's warning before the events happen. My father was a man, and I know the sex pretty well." She had talked herself out of breath, and we should say have been very glad to fill up the necessary pause as chorus, but we did not exactly know what to say, or which man had suggested this diatribe against the sex, so we only joined in generally, with a grave shake of the head and a soft murmur of, "They are very incomprehensible, certainly." "Now only think," said she, "there I have undergone the risk of having one of my remaining teeth drawn, for one is terribly at the mercy of any surgeon dentist, and I, for one, always speak them fair till I have got my mouth out of their clutches. And, after all, Mr. Hawkins is too much of a man to own that he was robbed last night." "Not robbed!" exclaimed the chorus. "Don't tell me," Miss Pole exclaimed, angry that we could be for a moment imposed upon. "I believe he was robbed, just as Betty told me, and he is ashamed to own it. And, to be sure, it was very silly of him to be robbed just at his own door. I dare say he feels that such thing won't raise him in the eyes of Cranford society, and is anxious to conceal it. But he need not have tried to impose upon me by saying I must have heard an exaggerated account of some petty theft of a neck of mutton, which, it seems, was stolen out of the safe in his yard last week. He had the impertinence to add he believed that was taken by the cat. I have no doubt, if I could get at the bottom of it, it was the Irishman dressed up in woman's clothes who came spying about my house with the story about the starving children." After we had duly condemned the want of candor which Mr. Hoggins had evinced and abused men in general, taking him for the representative in type, we got round to the subject about which we had been talking when Miss Pole came in, namely, how far in the present disturbed state of the country we could venture to accept an invitation which Miss Mattie had just received from Miss Forrester, to come, as usual, and keep the anniversary of her wedding day by drinking tea with her at 5 o'clock, and playing a quiet pool afterwards. Miss Forrester had said that she asked us with some diffidence, because the roads were, she feared, very unsafe, but she suggested that perhaps one of us would not object to take the sedan, and the others, by walking briskly, might keep up with the long trot of the chairman, and so we might all arrive safely at Overplace, a suburb of the town. No, that is too large an expression. A small cluster of houses separated from Cranford by about 200 yards of a dark and lonely lane. There was no doubt but that a similar note was awaiting Miss Pole at home, so her call was a very fortunate affair, as it enabled us to consult together. We would all much rather have declined this invitation, but we felt that it would not be quite kind to Miss Forrester, who would otherwise be left to a solitary retrospect of her not very happy or fortunate life. Miss Mattie and Miss Pole had been visitors on this occasion for many years, and now they gallantly determined to nail their colors to the mast and to go through Darkness Lane rather than fail in loyalty to their friend. But when the evening came, Miss Mattie, for it was she who was voted into the chair, as she had a cold, before being shut down in the sedan, like Jack-in-a-box, implored the chairman, whatever might befall, not to run away and leave her fastened up there to be murdered. And even after they had promised, I saw her tighten her features into the stern determination of a martyr, and she gave me a melancholy and ominous shake of the head through the glass. However, we got there safely, only rather out of breath, for it was who could trot hardest through Darkness Lane, and I'm afraid poor Miss Mattie was sadly jolted. Miss Forrester had made extra preparations in acknowledgment of our exertion in coming to see her through such dangers. The usual forms of genteel ignorance as to what her servants might send up were all gone through, and harmony and preference seemed likely to be the order of the evening, but for an interesting conversation that began I don't know how, but which had relation, of course, to the robbers who infested the neighborhood of Cranford. Having braved the dangers of Darkness Lane, and thus having a little stock of reputation for courage to fall back upon, and also, I dare say, desirous of proving ourselves superior to men in the article of candor, we began to relate our individual fears and the private precautions we each of us took. I owned that my pet apprehension was eyes looking at me and watching me, glittering out from some dull, flat, wooden surface, and that if I dared to go up to my looking glass when I was panic stricken, I should